Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What the Field. Today, we're joined by Roman and Hannah Wickes, who is, she comes all the way from Australia. She's been in journalism, she's been in marketing, and actually, she has been living in Berlin for a few years now. She was the former CMO for Ecosia, and now pursuing new adventures. Maybe, Hannah, tell us a bit of what brings you here to Spain. What are you doing in Madrid?
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. I'm in Madrid for a few more days, but I've been in Spain for the past month. So there's a fellowship program for female entrepreneurs that's been running for the last year and a half, and it's hosted by Spain, but the women come from all over Europe, or in my case, Australia. So I've just spent a month in rural Spain, seeing a lot of farms on the ground, which is interesting. Some regenerative agriculture, some definitely not. And that's been really, really fun. So that fellowship program just ended yesterday, so perfect timing to come and say hello to you both.
Very much. Well, thank you for coming and paying us a visit. We're here in Madrid, so Hannah, tell us a bit about yourself. Like, how does an Australian woman go all the way to Europe and become the chief marketing officer of one of the best well-known search engines in the world?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I think my journey probably started with journalism and media, hence why I love being on podcasts. And
you seem a natural.
Yeah, I love a microphone. I'm usually not the one in front.
She's got it in her.
I started off in radio when I was around 18. Whoa. And I worked in local radio. I worked on the country hours, so talking with farmers about agriculture and what the challenges they were facing in Australia, which is obviously heavily impacted by climate, and it's a harsh climate to be a farmer in. I started there, then I went into music, radio, journalism, festivals, a whole different thing, and that was in Sydney. And then I wanted to shift. So I was like, okay, and I was heading to the US, but got sidetracked in Europe and never left. And I got the tech bug. So for me, I was like, hang on, something really interesting is happening. And media is a more traditional industry. And so for me, I was like, what's happening in tech? And I'd worked a little bit in social media, and I started there. I was like, social media, Twitter, it's basically radio. It's just a different format. People
when
are talking.
Was this more or less?
Yeah, I was in Dusseldorf.
Right.
So I worked a little bit for Trivago, which is the big hotel meta search, and cut my teeth on tech and scaling companies and brand there. And then I joined Ecosia 2018 and helped grow their user base. And it was also, such a moment in time when it comes to climate. Greta had just started protesting. Things were hitting momentum. So it was a really interesting time to step into more climate tech.
And Hannah, do you see a difference nowadays from doing marketing from any other company or a socially or an impact company? Because we're seeing that now every company needs to have a purpose that impacts environment or society. So are we all communicating about impact, or is there people still marketing their product and maybe not their impact? How do they differ?
I think the reality is every company has an impact, and it's just some don't talk about their impact because it's not something necessarily to be proud of. And I think what's happened is consumers started asking questions and being slightly more aware of what they were buying, what they were eating, the tech they were working with. And at that point, it really started to shift. And you saw brands going, okay, wait, how can maybe we can actually grow through this. Maybe also I want to found a company because it will have more of a positive impact. And it kind of was this realization point in time that you don't have to necessarily sacrifice people and planet for profit. Maybe they can go hand in hand. And I think a lot of learnings were taken from the charity space and applied. I do think, to your point, that it has got very crowded because as consumers started asking questions, brand risk went up for companies who were doing business as usual, particularly as people's awareness on climate really started to grow.
Yeah. Okay. And Hannah, is that something you were prepared for? Meaning, like, you came from Trivago to a company like Ecosia, and were you actually prepared for those sorts of questions? Is that something that caught you a bit surprised? Like, we really need to be addressing those things.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I think because I've been a journalist, I knew how risky it can be for a brand when they misstep, or a government when they misstep, or a politician. And I knew the questions to ask, or the questions that could be asked. And I think with purpose companies in general, and also charities, nonprofits, you have further to fall. You are saying that you're doing this impact, this work, and if you mess up, in a way maybe even unconnected to your purpose, in a way that compromises your values, you burn the trust. Because companies that have purpose, one of the currencies they're using is trust. And if you have a company that's just a utility company and someone doesn't think about it, they just turn on their electricity provider, they don't necessarily think about the values of that company. But companies who are particularly in the direct-to-customer kind of space, they have trust and a relationship there. So for me, I was like, okay, the most important thing is trust, and we have to figure out how to market that, how to build that, and it can't just be marketing. It has to be in the DNA of the org for it to hold true.
Yeah.
So that's kind of for the companies that start with that trust because they have a purpose at their core, because they were born like that, and people decide to trust them, and you have to prove it, right? Everything you say, you need to prove it, because if not, people are going to ask questions. But what of the other ones? So what of the companies that maybe don't have that trust? They are incumbents, they're super big, and they want to go towards impact, and they want to marketing this because they're trying to do things better, but they can't because they don't have the trust, and they're going to be pointed at as greenwashing every time. How can they navigate this and marketing the good efforts they're doing and share it with their consumers?
I think you can't cut corners. And so you can't start marketing and talking about what you're doing in a tiny part of the business before you've got your house in order. And I think that's, we've seen that happen especially with the way the EU regulation is moving in terms like net zero or greenwashing, and big entities who've gone out and gone, okay, we'll make the flights net zero, or this is all organic cotton. If one tiny facet of your business is doing good, but the rest is not, and you're trying to convince consumers, it will come under scrutiny. It will either come through government regulation, from media, and also from the consumers themselves. So there is a risk in entering the space if you don't clean up house first. But on the flip side, it's incredibly important that the big companies start switching how they operate their business. Yeah. So it's fascinating that the space is growing. It's interesting that there's more competition, and I think that's a good thing. But with that comes more responsibility. And also people need to be held to account in those spaces as well.
Yes, and we're seeing, sorry, Roman, we're seeing more responsibility in that sense. When I myself speak to bigger companies, they're like, no, we cannot market that. Maybe you can because you're smaller, or you can have like a bigger trust with your consumers and they trust what you're saying, but we cannot market that because people would jump at us. So they because the consumers have been like developing this criteria, they're kind of more responsible, and they know people are going to jump at them if they communicate really that what you said, that small part. So it's good kind of this that we as consumers kind of are these greenwashing detectors, and maybe we get it wrong, but we're trying to do that because companies are starting to ask themselves, could I communicate this or not? So yeah.
And Hannah, I wanted to ask you, because from my perspective, you're in a privileged position because you've worked for a company that was communicating an impact. And at the same time, I mean, I know you're an advisor, for example, for World Fund, and your role is really to scrutinize on the impact that companies are saying they have towards society and the environment. What advice would you give to consumers, or to anyone really that wants to really assess the impact of a company and really be aware, okay, this is greenwashing, or this is some genuine impact? What are the red flags?
Oh, interesting question. I think don't look just at the marketing. The marketing can be like a quick, easy window in. So you see something on Instagram, or you see the company's done like a YouTube video, or they've got a big billboard campaign. Interesting. And it might be like, oh, maybe they're actually better than I thought, or maybe they've got a product that actually is aligned with my values. I think especially if it's a big purchase or something that's going to have a high carbon impact, really delve in. Look at their financial reports. And this is one of the things that I ask for them, and find out also, have a look at what reporters are saying as well, because you can often read, particularly at the end of the articles, a bit of a hint of what the company and the ethos is. And I often try and, especially if it's more early stage, I just watch an interview with one of the founders, and I can get a bit of a feel for how connected to the mission and the purpose they are. versus how much it's kind of profit over all else. And seeing that's really interesting. And I think there is a level of like, also seeing how much they've committed to different external authorities. So do they have science-based targets when it comes to their climate plan? Do they have a climate plan? And how committed are they to moving not just to net zero, but beyond? I mean, that's a very high standard, but it's what we should all be aiming for. And a little bit where do they put their profits? Because companies inherently make profits. That's why they're there. Sometimes they might be very VC backed as they're growing and they're not posting profits, but a lot of companies in the US are doing 1% for the planet, which is an interesting indicator. There's obviously also B Corp, and that movement has also come under some scrutiny, but who they're letting into the movement and who not, and what are the guidelines. But you can see quite quickly how companies have performed. It was interesting, I think The Guardian is a B Corp, and they posted yesterday, we've actually gone up in our recent review from B Corp. You can't keep your B Corp accreditation unless you repeat it every few years. And there's indicators not just about climate and planet, but also about how they treat their staff, which is something that consumers also care a lot about. The treatment of employees, the treatment of people in the supply chain as well. Yeah,
I think Christina knows a thing or two about becoming a B Corp, right?
You do too. Yeah. It's a long process, but it's good because it makes you look where you maybe hadn't realized before that you should look, because you're focused on your mission, and maybe it involves parts of the B Corp, but maybe not others, and it forces you to look where you hadn't thought of before. So I think it's a nice process to do. Yeah.
We had a big internal debate whether to go forward with it or not. In the end, we decided it was the good idea. I mean, we can't be marking our own homework.
Yeah.
And it always gives you better ideas. And it shouldn't be a goal per se. It should help you improve year after year. So that's in the end.
True.
And yeah, I find it so super interesting. The part of looking beyond the kind of the marketing should be kind of the thing to get your attention, right? And 100%. Then you should look behind that, because it's true that it doesn't need to be a lie, but it's in this era of kind of the post-truth era that everything could be true depending on how you look at that. When you look at the numbers, and the actions, there's no lying there. It's
100%.
Yeah.
So
we also wanted to talk a bit about trees, okay?
Of course.
Tree planting.
Because it's what we do and we love it. And there's nowadays everyone is offsetting by planting trees, or a lot of people intend to do it, but there's a lot of controversy around that.
Hot topic.
Yes. So there's displacement of communities. There's breaking habitats that were working well. So from the north of the world, we can plant trees on the south, but not necessarily contributing to the habitat in the south. Where are those offsets going, for example? Is it not forcing people to reduce, but just to offset and things like that? What's your take in this after navigating this topic for 5 years?
Yeah, I think talking about the 5 year span, I think it's changed a lot in that time period as well, because trees went through a different cycle where they were cool and everyone was talking about it and very excited, and then it got pushback because it seems so easy. You plant a tree and therefore you don't really have to change anything you're doing in your business, and the tree absorbs carbon and therefore you can keep putting carbon out.
Such a feel-good sort of thing.
It was like, it's so lovely. And then the reality is that with tree planting, you have to keep the tree alive, firstly. And the tree also has to be the right kind of tree for the environment. Otherwise, it can do more harm than good. For example, you can plant a whole field of eucalypt trees. I'm from Australia. I love a eucalypt.
Yeah, we have them here too.
But they are hugely problematic to plant in certain parts of the world because they are born to be bushfire trees, and so they explode. They have it's just not the right thing, and they also use huge amounts of water, and aggressively so
we had that in Spain,
in the north of Spain particularly, very popular for paper industry.
100%. And it's great for the paper industry, but terrible for biodiversity. So there's all these different pockets where controversy started to bubble up around tree planting. And then with offsets, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that space, there were bad actors in that space. And it is, I think one of the things I learned, which I really appreciated about the tree team at Ecosia, was how committed they were to the data and how committed they were to tracking the trees through multiple ways. So whether it was satellite data, field visits, and really ensuring that if we were going to continue working with different partners on the ground, that the trees from the first investment were there. And I think this is the thing when the supply chain is so long and a big company who has no connection to tree planting is buying carbon credits or offsets, but have no way of actually verifying if they're there or not. And there are good players in this space, and there needs to be, because we do need more trees on this planet. But at the same time, there can be really bad players. So I've seen or heard of offsets where a really beautiful native forest, hundreds of years old, is chopped down in order to plant new trees for offsets. So what's more interesting to me is how do we actually prevent deforestation in the first place? What are the root causes?
Exactly.
And then also, are there spaces where we need trees where we currently don't have them? And I actually think that's a fascinating one where it probably crosses over more with the work that crowd farming is doing, because agroforestry is a huge one, but how are we bringing trees into the farming landscape? How does that actually increase the amount of food and really support local communities? And that there's a lot of room for more tree coverage there. Yeah.
Yes, it's kind of the need of looking at it in a holistic way. Like if the problem that we're seeing in regenerative agriculture, but I guess also with forests and tree planting, it's the huge focus on carbon. If you only focus on carbon, maybe you cut down old trees and plant new ones because they're going to grow, and that it's easier to sum up the carbon that they're absorbing if you only focus on that. I guess you guys focused in beyond that, like in the communities, in the biodiversity and things like that, that through a holistic approach you can really know that the impact is being good overall and not just being about carbon, right?
100%. I think if you reduce a tree down to carbon, you're really like clipping like a lot of the benefits. So you have the carbon in the tree itself, but you also have the carbon in the soil. And then what else do you have in the soil? You have like a water table, and trees can be pretty instrumental there in increasing the level of the water table, which then means that you can grow more surface level crops, for example.
Huge need.
It's massive. And also like trees, like you can plant one tree, but that tree is probably not going to be a happy tree. Trees like to be in forests. They like to have other members of their species. Exactly. And trees actually do talk to each other through the roots, through the microorganisms. And so this kind of stuff is really important, that you have experts on the ground who are not just planting a monoculture. Yeah. And I think this is the part that we have to still navigate. But what makes me a bit sad is sometimes the broader criticism of trees. Yeah. And everything gets thrown out when it's like, actually, there are good ways to do this, and we need to figure that out. And we need, because beautiful native forests, if we lose all of those and we also don't replant those species, we're going to lose a lot of animals as well. And that biodiversity piece is super important.
Yeah. And what is the root cause normally for that deforestation? Is it climate change? Is it farming? What is it?
Was the pun intended?
It's a good question. And I think deforestation depends on which country you're in. Okay. And often it does relate to food. So land is cleared in order to grow more food at scale, and industrial agriculture can be a cause. It also can be a big producer moves in. We see sugarcane, for example, can be one. We can see tree plantations, fast-growing timber trees or paper trees can be another. We also see grazing. So there's often actually, like if you go into a landscape, for example, where there might be a lot of goats, like Ecosia works in Morocco, it's a very big area for us in a focus country. But goats are a real challenge. The goats there even climb trees. Yeah. But there will be tiny, tiny trees, but they're shrubs, and we don't even realize it's a tree. So if you're able to alter the pattern of the grazing, these trees will actually grow to the point that they will become a tree. And so there's different techniques. It's not just about tree planting. You can also find ways to kind of prune the trees so they grow differently. You can shift the grazing patterns. There's so much that can be done to bring a higher density of tree cover.
Yeah. I think that's a big area of focus for us at the moment as we try to bring... I mean, it's difficult from a regeneration perspective to try to change the mentality of the way farmers have been working for decades, and now you tell them, no, you need to plant trees. Hey, listen, I need this space to grow more crops, because more crops is more money. That's a bit the mentality we encounter sometimes. Well, it's not as simple as that, because you're going to reduce your water consumption, you're going to increase the biodiversity, which is going to increase pollination. That's going to benefit the current crops you've got at the moment, while consuming fewer resources.
I think I totally agree with that point. I think one of the challenges, it's not just on the farmers, it's actually on the agricultural policies and the funding and the subsidies.
I would agree.
So if you look at the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, it actually encourages farmers to have less trees because you get higher subsidies. So even if a farmer or their family farm had trees on it, they've often disappeared from the landscape because not only can you potentially grow more, but you also are getting more money from the policy. So there's this part where I'm like, it goes a bit deeper. So it actually takes, I think, and I come from a farming community in Australia, it takes a very brave farmer to go, you know what, I'm going to basically walk down this path that doesn't have subsidies and try and find a new kind of consumer and get my product to them with extra benefits. Maybe it's organic, maybe it's more biodiverse, maybe I can market this, but they often don't even have access to the consumer. So I think it's on the policymakers, it's on the big supply chains, which really push farmers in a different direction.
Incentivizing that.
They incentivize it. So I agree, but it is a mindset shift as well. But it's often a mindset shift back 1 or 2 generations. Like it's not that long ago when we had a lot of trees in the farming landscape.
I'd love for you to talk about one story where you brought closer the forest and the agriculture part. I'm sure that you have some projects that you've been part of around this, because one of the biggest issues that we see when we calculate kind of carbon footprint of food, etc., is land use. And we are seeing more and more that we're trying to bring the forest part and the what forests have into agriculture, so that we don't lose that part that in the beginning was like, okay, you're depleting all of these machines to capture carbon, and you're doing something that only brings carbon back into the earth, right? Into the air. And now we're trying to bring that back to create these machines in farms that again get soil back, get carbon back into the soil. How can we, or examples in which you have merged those two words of tree planting, but actually having kind of an impact in community, in food, in an additional benefits, etc.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. There's a few different examples. There's a really incredible kind of nonprofit working in Senegal and across the region who focus on forest farms, and that concept and the kind of forest garden, forest farm has been around for a while. So in Senegal, for example, it's one of the world's biggest producers of peanuts, which is great, but you don't want to just eat peanuts. So what a challenge there is like, how do you increase not just the food security, but the kind of different types of food that people can grow. So you would, in the forest farm in Senegal, for example, you would have acacia trees with their thorns around the border to protect from goats. Then you would have almost like rows of fruit trees down the middle, and they provide crucial shade, so your water isn't all evaporating if you're growing fruit and vegetables underneath. And so you actually end up being able to have like almost a market garden. And if you can sell directly in the marketplace, suddenly your turnover is quite good and your own food security is great. But I've also seen the flip side of that. I was in Uganda in February and we were visiting a tree planting project. And on the way, thankfully not with farmers we were working with, but there was just mass deforestation. Like trees are being cut in the last 2 weeks. I was like, what is going on? And the driver was like, oh, it's the sugarcane company. They've come in and said, oh, we'll pay you to clear this land of trees and then we'll fund the sugarcane, kind of like a venture capital. We'll give you the money to plant the sugarcane. You will get the money, though, in the return in 2 years. And while it's a lot of money for that farmer, for that individual farmer, there's actually very little security, because if that crop fails, there's nothing to feed the family. You can't eat just sugarcane. And it's a very risky scenario. So the best kind of projects I've seen are when the farmers are working very closely with a tree planting org or a non-profit, and they might have different agendas, but at the same time they can collaborate. So in Uganda, we also worked with the Jane Goodall Institute. And obviously Jane Goodall, she's one of the world's top scientists. Her focus is on chimpanzees. And there's only 5,000 left in Uganda. It was one of the biggest populations. And they're in tiny pockets of forest. And chimpanzees, if they don't get enough fruit in the forest, will go out and find it in the fields and the farmers. So there's actually quite a bit of tension. So their role was to kind of connect tiny forest corridors for wildlife in order to make sure that farmers weren't losing crops to chimpanzees. And at the same time, through doing that project, they were providing extra trees to farmers. and trees that could bring more income in the form of like fruit, for example. So it's a
Super
very
interesting.
You have one agenda, I want to create habitats for chimpanzees, and you combine it with another agenda, which is I want my crops to be safe. And you can actually find a way through tree planting and restoration to make that happen. I mean, not every country has the chimpanzee challenge, but
No, but each one has its challenge, and that's why it's interesting the approach of regenerative agriculture or these types of projects that go into each context and understand what's the problem there. And I found it super interesting what you said, that because there's some bad guys, we cannot stigmatize the whole tree planting. And the same happens with specific products. We've lived it, like, because in one specific area, this product is not farmed sustainably. We stigmatize a product, and that's a huge problem for farmers and a challenge. Like, I'm doing it sustainably, and that's why we should always look behind the big claims, right?
Take the time and do your research.
Yeah,
exactly.
But it's difficult.
It's difficult if you've got 10 minutes to go to the supermarket, what are you going to look for?
Yeah.
You just look at the labels, or I recognise organic, sort of. But that doesn't mean farmers are fairly paid, for example, or that the labour employed wasn't slave labour. It's simply that it says it's organic, no pesticides.
And I think one thing I'm seeing more is, particularly because I live in Berlin in Germany, is there are labels of where it was grown.
Yep.
And that I find super interesting because, for example, avocados, people are like, oh, it's a high footprint. Oh, it's travelled so far. Like, it's a very big difference between an avocado that's grown in Spain, if you're a European consumer, than an avocado that's grown on another continent.
In Peru, yeah.
And so there's this piece as well that I think it also comes down to how supermarkets and retailers approach, but also what's the legislation around, so consumers can make a choice. Like, if you don't have the information, you're not going to know where that was grown. And so that kind of piece, I think, really connects us with the land and the food that we're eating.
Agreed. Shall we talk a bit about entrepreneurship?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Fantastic. So actually you're touching on a topic that is supermarkets and perhaps small incumbents such as ourselves. And we've seen ourselves as a bit the fight between David and Goliath, right? And I think you've gone through the same thing, right? Because you were a small search engine fighting against the well-established players, Google, Bing, which I'm not really sure if it's a competitor, it's a partner. So what's your take? What advice would you give to smaller players that want to take on very well-established industries and create an impact?
I think this is the fascinating thing about entrepreneurship and startups in general, is that they're disruptors. And they're coming into a space because they have an idea about something that can be done differently. Whether it's a completely new concept or they're reinventing the wheel, but in a way that is more adapted to how we're living our lives now. It's a really privileged position in some ways because you get to build your brand from scratch. And obviously I've worked in marketing for a while, and this part is what fascinates me, is that you have to find your story, your why, and then figure out how you can disrupt a player that might have got a little complacent. So an example I think it's really interesting is fintech. And it's not, there's not a lot of huge green players in fintech. There's one called TreeCard that I work with a little bit in the US that Ecosia supported. But what happens there is that banks got a little bit complacent. It was, when you logged onto your bank app even like 2-3 years ago, there wasn't even an app. Like, it was tough. And so there were players that moved in and were like, this needs to be more user friendly. There has to be a way that I can transfer money to my friend and they get it instantly, not a week later. Like, it was this space. So if you are a true challenger brand, you have something that you're offering consumers. And I think in the interesting case with crowd farming, it's how direct it is, how connected you feel to the farmer. And a supermarket can't give me that. They can say, oh, it was grown here, or it was grown in France, or this one was grown in this town in Germany. But I still don't know who grew it. I don't know the story. And I think that that's the really fascinating piece for brands who are smaller and startups as they grow, to bring their users with them and they become the advocates. And that's how a true challenger brand can scale. And I think it's how Ecosia also scaled without users. Like, if your competitor is one of the biggest companies in the world, without users who are pushing for you and advocating for you and doing your word of mouth because they believe in the way you've set up your business model, I think it's a big challenge. Yeah.
Because Ecosia's growth was mostly through word of mouth? Or?
No, it was a mixture.
Right.
And what was clear about it, we had word of mouth, so we had our die-hard word-of-mouth users. But we also had a visual story. And this is the thing about particularly impact brands, is that sometimes you have a physical output of what you're doing. For us, it was trees. And so we were able to show the story of how those trees were being planted, how they were going, what was happening. And our users in some ways were shareholders for us. And they were so invested in those trees and the outcomes, they had a sense of ownership over that. So for us, we did a lot of visual storytelling marketing, whether that would be through a channel like YouTube or socials, also press, those kind of channels where things are more tangible. You can tell the story of what you're trying to do in a different way.
Yeah, I've seen some of the videos actually that were very, very entertaining to watch, like ask questions to our CEO, that sort of thing. That was a lot of fun.
And how do you keep this challenger spirit when you grow, when it's not just a bunch of people trying to change the world, but now you're hundreds of people, you're growing, you need to make some compromises in order to grow. How do you not lose that challenger spirit?
I think it's important to, interesting you use the word compromise, it's important to actively decide which ones you're willing to make, and don't lose the values you started with, because that's also where you can burn the bridge to user trust. So if you are acquired, for example, it's really important that you still have flexibility. I think a really interesting story here is Ben & Jerry's, a very strong activist brand, Vermont. Like it's a whole different feel to what they did. And when they were acquired by Unilever, that's a, okay. Yeah. And what was interesting was that in that acquisition process, they really push back on, like, you have to still let us be an activist brand. This is who we are. And they had to, in some ways, take Unilever with them on that journey. So that's a really kind of extreme example of being like, okay, this can happen, but this is what we will not compromise. So I think this self-analysis of who the brand is, where the trust is coming from, why do users trust you? And those are things you don't give up. Because if you give them up, then you lose the brand and you will shrink. So it's a different piece. I think for Ecosia, for example, our financial reports that we did monthly had hundreds of thousands of people looking at them, and that's not normal even for a listed company. And they were a core tenet of trust. They also showed how many trees we planted that month. They were the engagement method for our community. And if at any point we were to stop doing that piece of trust, even though it's done monthly rather than quarterly, like most financial reports, that would have been a big misstep. So there's these things that you have built, they're almost the foundations of trust, and you have to acknowledge what they are and don't compromise them. And also new employees, as you scale, bring on new employees, new facets of the business. Maybe you're acquiring another entity, for example, as you grow, to make sure that the culture is joined. That's a challenge, but it's worth spending that time.
Yep.
And to wrap up, Hannah, now that you're seeing so many people and talking to so many entrepreneurs, like what's hot at the moment in impact and sustainability? Where's the world like?
What makes you dream?
Changing?
Okay, that is a great question. I think my heart is with direct to consumer, like the B2C, and because I think those brands have an ability to change the conversation that we're having around climate,
raise
around
the awareness,
impact. And also around how these things intersect. It's not just a climate company. You're also dealing with social equity and engaging with people. So how the B2C brands operate in a different space, because we have to talk to big audiences. And so for me, I find myself when I'm working with startups in that space, and founders particularly, they've got a challenge on their hands. It's difficult to grow without capital and to bootstrap, but you often have to, because a lot of VC money goes into SaaS companies and B2B. So there's this challenge. I think the other part that I'm interested in is very much also on the flip side, is the deep tech, the scientists, the researchers who are like, okay, wait, how do I actually turn this knowledge I have, this research I've done, this solution I have, into a company that can scale, and actually not just scale in one country, but many. And this is the intersection. Particularly in Europe, the climate community and the tech community has grown to a point that I think we can really start scaling some of these really excellent kind of scientific research pieces that we have in Europe.
Yes, we need to bring the researchers to the drawing table, to the negotiating table. I think that's the next stage for all of us. Yeah, totally.
Well, Hannah, I'd love to spend hours chatting with you.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we have to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
It's our pleasure indeed. Thank you so much for being here. So this has been another episode of What the Field. Thank you for joining us. Another time, another week. I don't know. When's this going to be released? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.